July 30th, 2026. Somewhere over the emptiest, most remote stretch of the Kamchatka Peninsula, a volcano most people have never heard of just fired ash 5.5 miles straight up into the sky, directly into one of the busiest flight corridors on Earth. Shivaluch, one of the most explosively active volcanoes on the planet, has now logged over 300 separate ash advisories in 2026 alone, more than any other volcano tracked anywhere in the world this year. On July 27th, it sent an ash cloud rocketing up to flight level 350, 35,000 feet, the exact cruising altitude commercial jets use every single day to cross the North Pacific between Asia and North America. And this isn't a one-time blast. This is the tail end of the most intense, sustained eruption sequence this volcano has produced in years, with near-daily explosions punching ash straight into the airspace planes fly through right now. So stick with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why an ash cloud is genuinely one of the only natural hazards on Earth capable of shutting down a jet engine. Mid-flight, why this particular volcano has been doing this almost every single day without making a single headline, and what it would actually take for this to escalate into the kind of flight chaos we've seen before from volcanoes far less active than this one. Before we get into it, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and tap the bell icon so you get notified the second we post updates on this, because this eruption sequence is genuinely still unfolding as we speak, and the numbers you're about to hear are going to keep changing. And drop a comment down below. Have you ever been on a flight that got diverted or delayed because of volcanic ash, or lived anywhere near an active volcano? I want to hear the actual experience, because most people watching this have no idea how often this happens quietly in the background of global aviation. Stay with me through this one, because the ending of this video is going to change how you think about every single flight path map you've ever glanced at on a seatback screen. Let's start with what actually happened. Shivaluch sits on the northern end of the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia's far east, a stratovolcano rising 3,283 meters, close to 10,800 feet, in one of the most remote, sparsely populated corners of the planet. On July 27th, the Tokyo Volcanic Ash Advisory Center, the regional authority responsible for tracking ash hazards to aviation across that part of the Pacific, logged an ash cloud reaching flight level 350, 35,000 feet, moving northeast at a blistering 100 knots. That advisory was numbered 2026-305. Read that again. 305 separate formal ash advisories issued for a single volcano in under 7 months. That works out to more than one advisory per day on average for months on end, and it tells you everything about how sustained and relentless this eruption sequence has actually been, even though almost nobody outside the aviation and volcanology world has been paying attention. This latest blast wasn't an isolated spike either. Earlier in the same week, on July 22nd, Tokyo VAC logged another ash cloud at that same flight level 350, moving northeast so fast, at 100 knots, that it crossed the international dateline within hours, forcing responsibility for tracking the plume to be formally handed off from VAAC Tokyo to VAAC Anchorage, the American authority that monitors ash hazards approaching Alaska and the North American mainland. Go back another week to July 16th, and the volcano was still firing ash up to flight level 230, roughly 7 kilometers, as what one aviation report described as a record-setting July ash sequence continued to intensify day after day. And if you rewind further to July 5th, Shivaluch produced a genuinely major explosive episode, sending ash soaring to 12.2 kilometers, just over 40,000 feet, an altitude so serious that Russian volcanic authorities immediately raised the aviation color code for the volcano, straight to red, the highest possible alert level in the international system, used to warn pilots and airlines that a volcano is erupting explosively enough to pose an imminent hazard to aircraft. So when this video's title mentions ash reaching 33,000 feet, that number actually sits right in the middle of what this volcano has been doing basically non-stop through the entire month of July. Back on June 9th, an earlier advisory clocked a plume at exactly that height, flight level 330, 33,000 feet, drifting northeast at 10 knots. That's not an outlier reading. That's this volcano's normal behavior lately. Level of ash production so sustained and so high altitude that it's genuinely remarkable. This story hasn't dominated more headlines, and that in itself says something important that we're going to come back to later in this video. Now here's the part that should genuinely concern anyone who flies. This activity isn't confined to Russian airspace, sitting quietly over an empty peninsula. Just 1 week ago, on July 21st, an explosive eruption at Shivaluch sent ash up to 35,000 feet, and that plume didn't just linger over Kamchatka. It got caught in the jet stream. the same high-altitude river of fast-moving air that commercial jets use to speed up transoceanic flights, and rode it directly across the Bering Sea into Alaskan airspace. The result was immediate and concrete. Multiple flights were canceled at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport, including Alaska Airlines Flight 7011 from Anchorage to Nome. This is not a hypothetical, someday this could happen scenario. This already happened, 1 week before the writing of this very script. Real passengers, real cancellations, real disruption to real travel plans, all triggered by ash from a volcano most of those passengers had probably never heard of before their flight got canceled. So let's actually talk about why volcanic ash is such a uniquely dangerous hazard for aircraft, because this is genuinely one of the most fascinating and under-discussed intersections of geology and modern engineering, and understanding the mechanism here is what makes the rest of this story make sense. Volcanic ash isn't like ordinary smoke or a rain cloud. It's made up of tiny, jagged fragments of pulverized rock and glass ejected from deep inside the Earth at temperatures and pressures violent enough to shatter solid material into particles finer than flour. When a jet engine, essentially a machine designed to suck in enormous volumes of air and compress it at extreme temperatures, ingests that ash, several things happen almost simultaneously, and none of them are good. First, the abrasive glass particles sandblast the compressor blades and other moving components inside the engine, scouring away protective coatings and degrading performance within minutes. Second, and far more dangerous, the intense heat inside a jet engine's combustion chamber is more than hot enough to actually melt the glass particles in, the ash. That molten glass then flows further back into the engine, into cooler sections, where it resolidifies onto turbine blades and internal surfaces, essentially coating the inside of the engine in a layer of glass. This can choke off airflow, damage turbine blades, and in the most severe documented cases, cause a jet engine to flame out entirely, meaning it stops producing thrust altogether mid-flight. And here's the detail that makes this hazard genuinely unnerving for anyone who's ever glanced nervously out a plane window during turbulence. Volcanic ash is essentially invisible to the weather radar systems every commercial aircraft carries. That radar is built to detect water droplets, the kind found in rain and storm clouds, not fine mineral particles. Pilots flying directly into an ash cloud at night or in poor visibility may have absolutely no visual or instrument warning before the aircraft is already inside it. Often, according to aviation safety reporting, the very first sign that something is wrong is a change in engine sound or performance, by which point the aircraft is already fully inside the hazard. This isn't a theoretical worst case invented for a script like this one. It has already happened more than once in modern aviation history, and it's worth understanding exactly how close those incidents came to disaster, because it's the reason the entire global ash advisory system we're discussing today exists in the first place. In June of 1982, a British Airways 747 flying from Kuala Lumpur to Perth flew directly into an ash cloud from Indonesia's Mount Galunggung at night, with the crew initially having no idea what was happening. All 4 engines flamed out, one after another, leaving the aircraft essentially gliding, powerless, at high altitude over the ocean in complete darkness, with 240 passengers and crew on board. The pilots managed to restart the engines only after descending to a lower altitude where the ash concentration thinned out and the aircraft landed safely in Jakarta. But the windscreen had been so thoroughly sandblasted by the ash that the crew could barely see forward during the final approach and had to rely largely on instruments to land the plane. A remarkably similar incident happened again just 7 months later, in December of 1982, when a Singapore Airlines 747 flew into ash from the exact same volcano and suffered the same terrifying multi-engine flameout. These 2 incidents both survived through a combination of skill and fortunate circumstance rather than any advanced warning system, are widely credited as the direct catalyst for the creation of the modern international network of volcanic ash advisory centers, the same VAAC system that's been tracking Shivaluch's eruptions in near real time throughout this entire year. That system exists precisely because volcanic ash doesn't stay conveniently confined to the airspace, directly above the volcano that produced it. Once ash gets punched high enough into the atmosphere to reach the jet stream, exactly. What's been happening with Shivaluch's plumes reaching flight levels of 230, 330, and 350 throughout this month? It can travel enormous distances in a matter of hours, exactly as we saw with the July 21st cloud that crossed the Bering Sea into Alaska. The global aviation system responds to this threat with a genuinely elegant, if slightly nerve-wracking, layered defense. 9 regional volcanic ash advisory centers around the world, including Tokyo, which monitors this exact region of the Pacific, and Anchorage, which picks up responsibility once ash crosses toward North American airspace, continuously tracks satellite imagery, seismic data, From ground monitoring networks and pilot reports to model exactly where an ash cloud is, where it's forecast to move over the following 6, 12, and 18 hours, and at what altitude. That information gets translated into concrete guidance for airlines and air traffic control, sometimes closing specific altitude bands or entire flight corridors until a plume has dispersed or drifted clear. Now, here's a question worth pausing on, because it's exactly the kind of thing that should be nagging at you right now if you've been following along closely. If this volcano has produced over 300 ash advisories in under 7 months, sent ash to airline cruising altitude repeatedly, and already caused real flight cancellations in Alaska just last week, why isn't this a bigger story? Why haven't you heard about Shivaluch before today? The honest answer comes down almost entirely to geography, and it's genuinely one of the more interesting quirks of how natural disasters do or don't become global news. Sheveluch sits in one of the emptiest corners of Russia, on the northern Kamchatka Peninsula, roughly 280 miles north of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, the region's main city, in an area with extraordinarily low population density. Ask most people to name the world's most active volcano, and you'll hear Kilauea or Etna or Stromboli, places with dramatic lava footage, nearby towns, and tourists watching from a safe distance. Shivaluch almost never comes up in that conversation, and that says far more about who lives nearby than it does about the volcano's actual explosive power. By one measure, this volcano's eruptive record is genuinely staggering. Geological databases tracking major eruptions worldwide log 43 separate eruptions from Shivaluch at a volcanic explosivity index of 4 or higher, more than any other single volcano in that entire data set. This is, by that measure, the single busiest large eruption machine on the planet, and it simply doesn't make headlines because there's almost nobody standing close enough to film it happening. That doesn't mean this volcano is incapable of a genuinely historic eruption, and understanding what this volcano did just 3 years ago is exactly what puts the current activity into proper perspective. On April 10th and 11th of 2023, Shivaluch produced its largest eruption in 60 years. The mechanism behind it is something volcanologists had actually been watching build for months beforehand. A slow, unstable growth of a lava dome, essentially a mound of thick, sticky magma piling up inside the crater like pressure building behind a cork. When that dome finally failed, it triggered what's called a lateral blast, an eruption that doesn't just shoot straight up, but explodes sideways as the unstable dome collapses, similar in mechanism to the infamous 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption in the United States. That 2023 blast sent an ash plume soaring 20 kilometers into the sky, 66,000 feet, nearly double the cruising altitude of a commercial jet, and spread ash across an area of roughly 108,000 square kilometers, close to 42,000 square miles, an area of contamination roughly comparable to the entire size of Iceland. The nearby village of Kluchi, about 50 kilometers, 31 miles from the crater, was buried under 8.5 centimeters, well over 3 inches, of accumulated ash. That is what Shivaluch is capable of when its lava dome complex finally reaches its breaking point. And it's exactly why volcanologists are watching the current dome activity so closely right now. Because here's the detail that ties this entire month of relentless ash advisories back to that 2023 catastrophe. And it's the single most important piece of context in this whole story. All of this year's activity, every single one of those 305 advisories, is being driven by the exact same underlying mechanism, the growth and periodic collapse of unstable lava domes sitting inside the crater of what's known as Young Shivaluch, the newer, more explosively active portion of the broader volcanic complex. According to reports from Russia's Kamchatka Volcanic Eruption Response Team, the monitoring agency responsible for tracking the volcano around the clock. There are currently 2 active domes feeding this activity, one along the northern crater floor and a second, newer dome that began extruding on the western portion of the crater floor back in late December of 2025. By the end of February this year, that newer western dome had actually grown taller than the older northern dome and was already generating ash plumes reaching 9 kilometers, close to 30,000 feet, as what monitoring reports described as simply routine day-to-day activity for this volcano. Read that sentence again, because it's worth sitting with. Ash plumes reaching 30,000 feet deep into commercial cruising altitude are considered routine, unremarkable, background level activity for this particular volcano right now. That's the baseline. Everything above that, the July 5th spike to 40,000 feet. The repeated flight level 350 advisories through the back half of July represents this already elevated baseline becoming even more intense. This is exactly the kind of situation volcanologists watch most nervously, not because any single ash plume this month has been catastrophic on its own, but because of what a continuously growing, unstable lava dome complex represents structurally. Every explosion, every ash plume, every dome collapse recorded in the official monitoring logs this year is effectively pressure escaping from a system that keeps rebuilding itself and destabilizing again shortly afterward. The 2023 mega eruption happened when one of these dome collapse cycles finally reached a critical breaking point after months of buildup that volcanologists had actually been anticipating and warning about since mid-2022. The obvious, uncomfortable question hanging over this entire month's activity is whether the current dual dome complex, now actively growing on two separate sides of the crater simultaneously, is building toward another moment like that one, or whether this sustained near-daily venting is actually a kind of safety valve, releasing pressure gradually enough that a catastrophic collapse becomes less likely rather than more likely. Genuinely, nobody, not the monitoring teams at KVERT, not international volcanologists studying the satellite data, can answer that question with certainty right now. What they can do, and what they are doing, is exactly what's been happening all year, tracking every single explosion, measuring every plume height, and issuing advisory after. Advisory so that the aviation system downstream has the information it needs in near real time. Let's talk about what the aviation system actually looks like in practice, because this is where the volcano stops being a remote geological curiosity and starts directly affecting real flights carrying real passengers. The North Pacific route structure, the network of flight paths airlines use to connect cities like Tokyo, Seoul, and Beijing, with Anchorage, Seattle, Los Angeles, and cities across North America, runs directly across or near the airspace Kamchatka's volcanoes periodically fill with ash. When VAAC Tokyo or VAAC Anchorage issues an advisory placing an ash cloud at a specific flight level across a specific stretch of airspace, airlines have essentially three options. They can reroute flights around the plume entirely, adding time and fuel costs to the journey. They can adjust cruising altitude to fly above or below the contaminated layer, assuming a safe enough vertical gap exists, and air traffic control can accommodate the change. Or, in the most disruptive cases, exactly what happened in Anchorage just last week. Flights get delayed or canceled outright until the plume has cleared the relevant airspace or dispersed enough to no longer pose a credible hazard. None of these options are free. Rerouting costs airlines real money and extra. Fuel and crew hours. Cancellations cost airlines revenue and cost passengers their travel plans, exactly as it did for everyone booked on that Anchorage to Nome flight. And unlike a hurricane or a snowstorm, which meteorologists can typically forecast days in advance with real precision, a volcanic eruption can begin with essentially no warning at all, meaning airlines and air traffic controllers are frequently reacting to a hazard that appeared on their radar, so to speak, only hours before it needed to be avoided. If you want a sense of just how disruptive this kind of hazard can become when a volcano truly escalates beyond what Shivaluch has done so far this year, you don't have to look far. In April of 2010, Iceland's Eyjafjallajökull volcano erupted with a relatively modest amount of magma by geological standards, but the ash it produced was unusually fine due to the eruption occurring beneath glacial ice, and prevailing winds carried that fine ash directly across some of the busiest airspace on the planet, over the United Kingdom and continental Europe. The resulting disruption became the largest air travel shutdown since the Second World War. Roughly 100,000 flights were canceled over the following week, stranding an estimated 10 million passengers worldwide and costing the global airline industry well over $1 billion in losses. That entire catastrophe came from a volcano most people, again, had never heard of before it happened, producing an eruption that, purely by the numbers, was not even close to the largest volcanic event of the past century. What made it so disruptive wasn't the size of the eruption. It was the combination of an extraordinarily busy piece of airspace sitting directly downwind of the ash, and regulators at the time responding with a blanket, precautionary shutdown of enormous stretches of European airspace rather than the more targeted, altitude-specific routing decisions that are more common today. Aviation authorities have genuinely learned from that event, refining how ash concentration thresholds are measured and how selectively airspace gets closed, which is part of why Shivaluch's relentless activity this year has produced targeted flight cancellations in specific corridors like the Anchorage to Nome route, rather than a blanket North Pacific shutdown. But Eyjafjallajökull remains the clearest possible illustration of exactly how fast a volcano nobody was watching closely can become the single biggest story in global aviation for an entire week. So where does that leave Shivaluch right now, today, as this video goes up? The honest picture is one of sustained, elevated, but so far contained hazard. 305 advisories through July 27th, ash repeatedly reaching flight levels of 230, 330, and 350, squarely inside the altitude band commercial. Jets use every single day across the North Pacific. Real, documented flight cancellations already happening in Alaska within the past week. 2 actively growing lava domes inside the crater that produced the volcano's largest eruption in 6 decades just 3 years ago, and an aviation monitoring system built specifically in response to 2 terrifying near disasters back in 1982, currently working exactly as designed, tracking every single explosion in close to real time, and feeding that information directly to the airlines and air traffic controllers who need it. What nobody can tell you with certainty is whether this sustained activity represents pressure being safely released bit by bit, or whether it's the buildup toward another major dome collapse on the scale of what happened in 2023. That uncertainty isn't a failure of the science. It's an honest reflection of where volcanic forecasting genuinely stands today, extraordinarily good at detecting and tracking, and eruption once it begins, still fundamentally unable to predict with precision exactly when the next major escalation will happen. If you're someone who regularly flies routes across the North Pacific, between East Asia and North America specifically, here's what's actually worth knowing rather than worrying about. Airlines and air traffic control are already actively monitoring this volcano and adjusting routes accordingly, which is precisely why you likely haven't heard about most of the 300-plus advisories issued this year, because in the overwhelming majority of cases, the system is quietly working exactly as intended, rerouting flights around the hazard before passengers ever notice a disruption. The Anchorage cancellations from last week are the exception that makes headlines specifically because they represent the system's more visible failure mode, when a plume moves fast enough or arrives close enough to a departure window that outright cancellation becomes the safest option. If you have an upcoming flight on this route and want to check for potential disruption, airlines will notify you directly if your specific flight is affected, and checking your airline's app or website in the days immediately before departure remains the most reliable way to know if this particular eruption sequence has touched your itinerary. Beyond that, this is fundamentally a story to watch rather than a story to personally prepare for, unless you happen to live in the small, sparsely populated communities of Kamchatka itself, where ashfall from a genuinely large eruption remains a real and serious hazard to health, infrastructure, and agriculture, exactly as it was for the village of Kluchi back in 2023. What we're really watching for going forward is simple to describe and genuinely uncertain to predict. Does the Western Dome that's been growing since December continue expanding at its current pace, or does it show signs of the kind of instability that preceded the 2023 collapse? Does the daily advisory count, currently averaging more than 1 a day for the entire year, continue at this pace, taper off as pressure finds a stable equilibrium, or spike further as we head deeper into the back half of the year? And critically, does any future explosion punch ash high enough and in a direction that puts it squarely across a heavily trafficked flight corridor at exactly the wrong moment? The same unlucky combination of factors that turned Eyjafjallajökull from an obscure Icelandic volcano into a headline that grounded 10 million travelers. Right now, the monitoring infrastructure built specifically to answer these questions in as close to real time as physically possible is doing exactly what it was designed to do, watching one of the most relentlessly active volcanoes on Earth erupt after eruption, advisory after advisory, in one of the emptiest corners of the planet that just happens to sit directly beneath one of the busiest stretches of sky in the world. We'll keep tracking this one closely, every new VAAC advisory, any sign of escalation in the dome complex, and any further flight disruptions as this sequence continues to play out. If this is the kind of story you want to stay ahead of, subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon so you're notified the moment we post an update. Because with 305 advisories already logged and counting, this almost certainly won't be the last one this year. And drop that comment below. Have you ever flown near an active volcano or had a flight affected by ash you didn't even know was happening until you got the notification? I read every single one of these and I want to hear your story. See you in the next one.